The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting shadows across the paneled walls of Sterling Manor. Outside, the autumn wind of 1922 whispered through the pines, carrying with it the scent of coming winter. Alexander Sterling sat in his leather chair, hands trembling slightly as he poured amber whiskey into two crystal glasses. At 75, his body bore the weight of decades, but his eyes still held the sharp clarity of a man who had built an empire and buried more than his share of ghosts. Across from him, James Sterling Jr. shifted in his seat, 15 years old, tall for his age, with his grandfather's dark hair and his grandmother's gentle mouth. The boy had come to say goodbye. Tomorrow he would board the train to Boston, to university, to a life beyond the Wyoming plains that had shaped 3 generations of Sterling men. Xander pushed one glass across the polished mahogany table. James Jr.'s eyes widened. "Grandpa, I'm not old enough. You're old enough to leave home. You're old enough to hear what I'm about to tell you." Xander's voice was gravel and smoke, worn smooth by time but still carrying weight. "Drink slow. Listen well." The boy took the glass with uncertain hands. Xander raised his own, the whiskey catching firelight like liquid gold. "I'm going to tell you about the winter that taught me what a man truly owes. Not to the world, not to his reputation or his bank account, but to those too weak to fight for themselves." James Jr. sipped, winced at the burn, but kept his eyes on his grandfather. Waiting. Xander leaned back, gaze drifting to the window where darkness pressed against the glass. Beyond that darkness, 43 years stretched backward like a bridge across time. He could see it all still. The snow, the blood, the woman on the church steps with death in her eyes and a baby in her arms. "Listen well, boy, because at your age I thought wealth made a man. By 34 I learned different." The old man closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the firelit room had faded. In its place, another winter, another life. December 15th, 1879. The snow fell in thin, scattered whispers across the Wyoming territory, covering the scarred earth in a ghostly shroud. Alexander Sterling, 34 years old and worth more than most men would see in 10 lifetimes, sat rigid in his enclosed carriage as it rolled through the darkness toward home. The meeting in Cheyenne had gone poorly. Judge Nathaniel Whitmore, fat with corruption and red with rage, had accused Xander of sabotage, of deliberately exposing the fraudulent silver assay reports from the Silverbrook mine, of costing respectable investors their fortunes. Xander had not denied it. He had simply stood, buttoned his coat, and walked out of the smoke-filled office with $80,000 of potential profit dying on the table behind him. He did not care. Money came easily to Alexander Sterling. It always had. 3 gold mines across Wyoming and Colorado, each one pulling wealth from the earth like water from a well. Major shares in the Union Pacific Railroad. 50,000 acres of grazing land leased to ranchers at rates that made him richer every year, whether he lifted a finger or not. A stone mansion on a hill outside Dry Hollow, 15 rooms that echoed with silence and memory. $2.3 million. That was his net worth, according to the account books his clerks maintained with meticulous care. Enough to buy anything, everything, except the 2 lives that mattered most. Victoria, Samuel, 4 years dead. 4 years of ash and guilt and the hollow ache of a house that would never again hold laughter. The carriage lurched over a frozen rut. Xander braced himself against the wall, jaw tight. His driver, old Thomas Birch, called down an apology that Xander ignored. The cold had seeped through the carriage walls, turning his breath to fog, but Xander barely noticed. He had grown accustomed to cold, inside and out. They passed through Dry Hollow proper just after 11. The town slept under its blanket of snow. Oil lamps flickered behind curtained windows. The saloon glowed with dull amber light, voices raised in drunken song. Xander did not look. He never went to the saloon anymore. Never went anywhere except his office, his mines, and the endless circuit of business that kept his hands busy and his mind away from the locked rooms of Sterling Manor. The church stood at the end of Main Street, its white steeple low against the black sky. A single lamp burned in the tower window. Reverend Thornton no doubt praying or drinking or doing whatever it was that men of God did when the world turned dark and cold. Xander was turning his gaze away when he saw her, a shape on the steps, crumpled, dark against the white snow. Stop. Thomas pulled the horses to a halt. Xander was out of the carriage before the wheels stopped moving, boots crunching through frozen drifts. His breath came faster now, each exhale a white plume in the frigid air. She lay halfway up the church steps, body curled around something small. Blood had soaked through her dress, turning the fabric black in the dim light. Her hair, tangled and matted with ice, hung across her face. One hand clutched the church door, fingers frozen in a final desperate plea. The other hand held a baby. Xander felt his heart stop. For one terrible moment, he was standing in his own burning home, staring at the locked door behind which his wife and son had died. For one terrible moment, he was watching the flames eat through wood and hope, knowing he was too late, too slow, too far away to matter. Then the woman moved, a shudder, a breath. The baby whimpered, thin and weak. Xander dropped to his knees, snow soaking through his wool trousers. He touched the woman's shoulder, gentle despite the urgency racing through his veins. Her eyes opened, blue wide, filled with a terror so deep it had no bottom. Please. The word came out as barely more than a whisper, frosted at the edges. Please help us. Xander looked at the baby, a newborn, no more than days old, wrapped in blood-stained linen that provided almost no protection against the killing cold. The child's lips were starting to turn blue. Hypothermia. Minutes away, maybe less. He did not ask questions, did not demand explanations or weigh the risks. He simply gathered the woman into his arms, one hand supporting her head, the other cradling the baby against his chest. She weighed almost nothing, bones and fear and fading warmth. Thomas had climbed down from the driver's seat, eyes wide with shock. Mr. Sterling, sir, is she alive? Barely. Xander carried her to the carriage, moving as quickly as he dared on the ice-slicked ground. Get us home, fast. But sir, shouldn't we take her to Doc Morrison or the sheriff? No, the word came out harder than Xander intended, but he did not soften it. Thomas knew better than to argue. The old driver climbed back to his seat, took up the reins, and urged the horses into motion. Inside the carriage, Xander stripped off his bearskin coat, worth $300 and lined with Canadian fur. He wrapped it around the woman and child, tucking it close. Heat. She needed heat. The baby needed warmth before its small heart simply stopped beating. The woman's eyes fluttered. She tried to speak, but only a cracked sound emerged. Xander pulled a silver flask from his inner pocket, unscrewed the cap with one hand, and pressed it to her lips. Small sips, slow. She drank, coughed, drank again. Color returned to her face by degrees, though the bruises were becoming visible now. Her left eye was swollen nearly shut. Split lip, finger-shaped marks on her throat. Someone had tried to kill her. The baby stirred against Xander's chest, and without thinking, he began to hum. An old song, one Victoria used to sing to Samuel. The melody came back to him like muscle memory, something his body remembered even when his mind had tried to forget. The woman stared at him, those wide blue eyes searching his face with something that might have been hope, or might have been simple disbelief that anyone would stop to help. Who are you? She whispered. Alexander Sterling. And you're going to live. It was not a promise, it was an order. Xander had learned long ago that sometimes the only way to survive was to refuse any other option. The carriage rolled faster now, wheels clattering over frozen earth. Xander looked out the window and saw Sterling Manor rising against the night sky. 3 stories of stone and timber, windows dark as empty eyes. For 4 years, he had kept most of those windows shuttered, kept the doors locked, kept everything exactly as it had been the night Victoria and Samuel died. Tonight, he would open those doors again. Thomas brought the carriage to a stop at the main entrance. Xander did not wait for assistance. He carried the woman up the steps, kicked the heavy oak door open with his boot, and stepped into the cold darkness of his home. The entry hall smelled of dust and disuse. Furniture stood draped in white sheets like sleeping ghosts. Xander's footsteps echoed on marble floors as he moved toward the main staircase, the woman's weight shifting slightly in his arms. She had lost consciousness again. Better, perhaps. Less fear that way. He climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, moving by memory through hallways he had not walked in years, past the library, past the guest rooms, past his own chamber, untouched since the night of the fire. To the door at the end of the hall, Victoria's room. Xander stopped, one hand on the brass knob. He could hear his own breathing, harsh and unsteady. Behind this door lay everything he had tried to bury. The bed where she had slept, the vanity where she had brushed her hair each morning while humming hymns, the wardrobe still full of silk dresses that would never be worn again. And beside the bed, the cradle where Samuel had dreamed his last dreams. Xander turned the knob. The door swung open on silent hinges, and he stepped into the past. Moonlight streamed through uncurtained windows, illuminating a room frozen in time. The bed, perfectly made, white linen smooth and waiting. The vanity, bottles of French perfume still arranged in careful rows. The wardrobe, door slightly ajar, revealing the ghost of pale fabric within. The cradle, empty, waiting. For 4 years, Mrs. Calloway, his housekeeper, had maintained this room exactly as Victoria had left it, dusted weekly, windows open to air it out. Linens changed every month whether they had been slept in or not, waiting for a ghost that would never return. Until tonight. Xander laid the woman gently on the bed, her dark hair spreading across Victoria's white pillow. The baby, still wrapped in the bearskin coat, whimpered softly. He placed the child in the cradle with hands that trembled despite his best efforts to keep them steady. The woman's eyes opened again, focusing with difficulty on the room around her, on the luxury, the warmth beginning to seep back into the air as Xander moved to light the lamps, on the cradle where her baby now lay. "Where am I?" Her voice was stronger now, though still frayed at the edges. "My home. Sterling Manor. You're safe here." "No." She tried to sit up, panic flooding her features. "No, he'll come. He'll find us. He'll kill her. He'll kill me. He always said he would if I yelled and I ran, and he'll come and—" Xander caught her shoulders. Gentle but firm, made her look at him. "Listen, you ran. That took courage. You survived. That took strength. And now you're here, and whoever hurt you will have to go through me to reach you or that child. You don't understand. I don't need to understand, not tonight. Tonight you rest. You heal. We'll deal with the rest when you're strong enough to stand." He released her shoulders, stepped back. The woman sank into the pillows, exhaustion overcoming terror. Her eyes drifted closed. Within moments, her breathing had evened into the shallow rhythm of sleep. Xander looked down at the baby in the cradle. The child had stopped shivering, color returning to her tiny face. A girl, then. He could see it now in the delicate features, the small rosebud mouth. 4 years ago, he had stood in this same room and made a silent vow. He had failed to save Victoria and Samuel, failed to be there when they needed him most, failed to protect the two people who had made his fortune mean something beyond numbers in a ledger. He would not fail again. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made him turn. Mrs. Calloway stood in the doorway, gray hair in a nightcap, robe wrapped tight against the cold. Her eyes went wide as she took in the scene. The woman in Victoria's bed, the baby in Samuel's cradle, Xander, standing between them like a sentinel. "Mr. Sterling." Her voice carried shock and something deeper. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition that everything had just changed. "I heard the carriage. I thought—" "Fetch warm water, clean linen, and the medicine chest from the library." "And Mrs. Calloway." He met her eyes. Not a word to anyone. Not yet. She nodded once, sharp and certain, then disappeared down the hallway. Xander moved to the window, looking out over the snow-covered grounds of his estate. Somewhere out there, beyond the fence line, beyond the dark shapes of pine forests, a man was searching. A man who had beaten this woman bloody and left her to die in the cold. A man who believed he had rights that superseded mercy or justice or simple human decency. That man would come looking. Xander welcomed it. His reflection stared back at him from the dark glass. 34 years old, wealthy beyond measure, empty beyond words. Until tonight, he had been a shell, going through the motions of life, building his fortune higher, while his soul grew smaller. Tonight, something had changed. Some locked door inside him had cracked open, letting in light and pain in equal measure. He turned back to the woman and child, these strangers who had stumbled into his carefully maintained numbness and shattered it beyond repair. I don't even know your name, he said quietly, though she could not hear. But I know this. You came to my door when you had nowhere else to go. The church turned you away. The law failed you. Everyone who should have helped left you to die in the snow. He moved closer to the cradle, looked down at the sleeping infant. So I'm making you a promise. Both of you. I failed before. I won't fail again. Outside, the wind picked up, driving snow against the windows in soft whispers. Somewhere in that darkness, danger approached. But inside Sterling Manor, in a room that had been a tomb for 4 years, life had returned. And Alexander Sterling, millionaire and hollow man, found himself standing guard over two souls who needed him more than all the money in Wyoming could ever matter. He pulled a chair close to the cradle, sat down, and settled in to wait. It would be a long night. But Xander had spent 4 years in the dark. He knew how to wait, how to watch, how to prepare for whatever dawn would bring. The baby stirred, made a small sound. Without thinking, Xander reached out and placed one calloused hand gently on her tiny chest, feeling the steady beat of her heart. Alive, fighting, refusing to surrender, just like her mother. And in that moment, something inside Xander Sterling, something he thought had died in the fire 4 years ago, flickered back to life. Purpose. In the leather chair beside the dying fire, old Xander shifted his weight, the memory still vivid as yesterday despite the 43 years that had passed. James Jr. had not moved, the whiskey glass forgotten in his hand, eyes fixed on his grandfather's weathered face. Grandpa, the boy's voice was soft, uncertain. You brought a stranger to your home. That was dangerous. Xander's mouth curved in something that was not quite a smile. Boy, I just brought two strangers. Danger was already waiting at the door. He closed his eyes, drew a breath that rattled slightly in his chest and let the past pull him under again. The clock in the downstairs hall struck midnight, each chime echoing through Sterling Manor like a heartbeat. Xander sat motionless in the chair beside the cradle, every muscle tensed, every sense alert. Calloway had come and gone, bringing water and bandages in the oak medicine chest that still bore Victoria's initials carved into the lid. She had cleaned the woman's wounds with practiced efficiency, dressed her in one of Victoria's nightgowns, and left without asking questions Xander could not yet answer. The baby slept. The woman slept. The house held its breath. Then Xander heard it, the sound that turned his vigilance into certainty. Glass breaking, downstairs, in the library. He was on his feet instantly, moving toward the bedroom door with the trained quietness of a man who had spent years walking through unstable mine shafts where one wrong step could bring the mountain down. He pulled the door closed behind him, turned the key in the lock. Whatever was coming, it would have to go through him first. The hallway stretched before him, dark except for the moonlight streaming through tall windows. Xander moved along the wall, boots silent on Persian carpet. At the top of the stairs, he paused, listening. Footsteps, heavy, unsteady, moving through the first floor with the recklessness of either stupidity or desperation. Xander descended the staircase, keeping to the edges where the wood was less likely to creak. In the entry hall, he stopped beside a decorative side table and opened the drawer with practiced ease. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay his Colt .45, single-action revolver, 6 rounds, ivory handle engraved with his initials. He had carried this gun for 15 years, through claim disputes and labor strikes, and the ugly business of building an empire in territory where law was often nothing more than whoever held the biggest stick. He checked the cylinder by touch. Loaded. Ready. The footsteps had stopped. Xander could hear breathing now, harsh and ragged, coming from the library. He moved toward it, gun held low and ready, years of muscle memory guiding his hands. The library door stood ajar. Through the gap, Xander could see broken glass scattered across the hardwood floor, moonlight glinting off the shards. One of the tall windows had been smashed inward. Snow swirled through the opening, bringing with it the bitter cold of the Wyoming night. And standing in that cold, illuminated by a shaft of pale light, was the man who had come for his wife. Silas Bennett. Xander recognized him instantly, though they had not spoken in 4 years. 44 years old, built like a man who spent his life breaking things with his hands, unshaven, drunk by the smell rolling off him, and holding a knife, not just any knife, a hunting blade, 10 inches of folded steel, the kind trappers used to gut elk in the field. The same kind of knife Xander had found under his bed the morning after the fire. The knife that had been used to jam the lock on Victoria's bedroom door, trapping her and Samuel inside while the house burned. The knife marked with the initials SB. Xander raised the Colt, thumb pulling back the hammer with a click that echoed like thunder in the silent room. Silas spun, eyes wild. When he saw Xander, something ugly twisted across his face. Recognition, hatred, and beneath it all, fear. Sterling. Bennett. They stared at each other across the broken glass and cold air. Xander's hand remained steady on the gun. He had never killed a man, but in that moment, he discovered he was willing to learn. "That's my wife you got up there." Silas's voice was thick with whiskey and rage. "My child. You broke into my house. That's trespassing. I want what's mine." Xander took one step forward, then another. The gun never wavered. "Get out." "She belongs to me. The law says so. A man's got rights to his property. Get out, or stay here permanent." The threat hung in the air between them, cold and sharp as the broken glass under their feet. Silas looked at the gun, looked at Xander's face. Whatever he saw there made him take a step backward, knife lowering slightly. "This ain't over, Sterling. She's my wife. That's my daughter. You can't just steal a man's family." "Then bring the law." "I will. And when I do, you'll see what happens to men who think their money puts them above God's natural order." Silas backed toward the broken window, glass crunching under his boots. At the sill, he paused, turned back with eyes full of poisonous promise. "You think you saved her, but all you did was buy her a few more days of breathing. I'll have her back, and when I do, she'll learn what happens to wives who run." He climbed through the window and vanished into the night. Xander did not lower the gun until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely into the distance. Even then, he stood motionless for a long moment, listening to his own heartbeat, feeling the weight of what had just been set in motion. This was not over. Silas had made that clear. And Xander knew enough about men like Bennett to understand that pride and possession were sometimes stronger than reason or self-preservation. The fight had just begun. He moved through the house, checking every window, every door, locked them all, drew the heavy curtains. In the entry hall, he paused beside the coat rack where Victoria's old Winchester rifle still hung. 30-30 caliber, lever action, 17 rounds in the magazine. He took it down, checked the action. Smooth, reliable. Then he returned upstairs. Outside Eleanor's door, he paused, listening to the quiet breathing within. Satisfied they were safe for now, he unlocked the door quietly and slipped inside, locking it again behind him. Eleanor stirred at the sound. Her eyes opened, found him in the darkness. Was that him? Yes. She tried to sit up, panic rising again. Xander crossed to the bed, set the rifle against the nightstand where she could see it. "He's gone. He'll come back." "I know." She stared at him, searching for something, reassurance maybe, or simply the truth. "Why are you doing this? Men don't help women they don't know, not without wanting something." Xander sat down in the chair beside the bed, the Colt still in his hand. For a long moment he said nothing. Then quietly the words came. 4 years ago, my wife and son died in a fire. I was in Cheyenne on business, signing contracts, making money. When I got the telegram, I rode through the night to get home. But I was too late. The house had already burned. They were already dead." He paused, thumb absently tracing the ivory handle of the gun. "Later, I found evidence. The fire wasn't an accident. Someone had locked their bedroom door from the outside. Someone had wanted them to burn." The woman's breath caught. "Who?" "I didn't know then. The sheriff ruled it an accident, closed the case. And I spent 4 years building my fortune higher, thinking if I just worked hard enough, if I just made enough money, I could somehow fill the hole they left behind." He looked at her directly now, his eyes holding hers in the dim light. "Tonight I saw you on those church steps, saw your baby, and I realized something. Money can't bring back the dead, but it can save the living. So that's why I'm doing this. Not because I want something from you, but because I need to prove I'm not the coward I was 4 years ago." Silence filled the room. Outside, the wind had picked up again, driving snow against the windows in waves. Inside, two strangers sat in the darkness. bound together by violence and chance, in the fragile hope that sometimes, against all odds, the world offered second chances. "My name is Eleanor," the woman finally said. "Eleanor Bennett, and my daughter is Grace. Alexander Sterling, but most people call me Xander. Mr. Sterling, just Xander. And you don't have to say anything else tonight. Just rest. Heal. We'll deal with tomorrow when it comes." Eleanor lay back against the pillows, her hand moving to touch the cradle where Grace slept. Checking. Always checking. "He'll kill her," she whispered. "If he gets her back, he'll kill her just like he killed the others." Xander felt something cold settle in his chest. Others? 3 daughters before Grace: Anne, Mary, Rose. Her voice was flat, empty. All dead. He wanted sons. When I gave him daughters, he made sure they didn't survive. Anne died of fever at 2 weeks when he refused to fetch the doctor. Mary was stillborn after he beat me. Rose lived an hour before he threw her against the wall. The words came out mechanical, drained of emotion. This was survival, the only way to speak such horror without breaking. Eleanor's voice had gone flat, empty of everything except the simple recitation of horror. This was not grief. This was survival. The only way to carry such weight was to drain it of emotion, to turn it into facts that could be spoken without breaking. Xander said nothing. There were no words adequate to such evil, no comfort that could touch such pain. So he simply sat, bearing witness, offering the only thing he had: his presence, his protection, his refusal to look away. "I thought about dying," Eleanor continued, "so many times, but then I got pregnant again, and I thought maybe this time it would be different. Maybe this time God would give me a son, and Silas would stop hitting me, and we could be a family like normal people." She laughed, but the sound held no humor. "Grace was born 3 days ago, in our cabin, no doctor, no midwife, just me and him. When he saw she was a girl, he started drinking. Didn't stop. Tonight he came at me with his fists, said I was cursed, said God was punishing him through me, said if I couldn't give him sons, I was no better than livestock." Her hand moved unconsciously to her ribs, where bruises darkened her skin. I grabbed Grace and ran. Didn't think, didn't plan, just ran through the snow, with nowhere to go except away. The church was the first place I saw with lights on. I thought, her voice cracked, I thought God's house would have mercy. But they turned you away. The preacher opened the door, looked at me, looked at Greatgaman, and said he couldn't interfere in a husband's rights. Then he closed the door and locked it. Xander felt rage building in his chest, hot and sharp. Not the wild fury of a moment, but something colder, more deliberate, the kind of anger that did not explode but instead settled into bone and sinew, becoming purpose. "Do you have family? Anyone who could help?" "My father sold me to Silas when I was 16. $200 and a mule. Haven't seen him since." "Friends?" "Silas didn't like me talking to other women. Said they'd give me ideas." Xander stood, moved to the window, looked out at the snow-covered darkness. Behind him, he could hear Eleanor's breathing, steady now, exhaustion finally pulling her towards sleep. "Eleanor?" "Yes?" "You asked why I'm helping you. Here's the other reason. 4 years ago, someone hurt my family, and the law did nothing. The sheriff closed the case. The town forgot. And I spent 4 years wondering if justice even exists, or if it's just something we tell ourselves to sleep at night." He turned to face her. "You and Grace are going to live. You're going to heal. You're going to stand up in front of all and everyone and tell the truth about what that man did. And then we're going to make damn sure the law can't ignore you." Eleanor stared at him, tears sliding down her bruised face. Not tears of sadness, but something else. Recognition, maybe. Or the fragile beginnings of hope. "You really think we can win?" "I think you already won by surviving. Everything else is just making it official." She closed her eyes, and within moments, sleep claimed her. Xander returned to his chair, positioned the Winchester within easy reach, settled in for another long watch. At some point near dawn, Mrs. Calloway appeared with coffee and bread. She said nothing, just set the tray on the table and left. But her eyes, when they met Xander's, held approval. The house grew lighter as the sun rose, painting the snow-covered world beyond the windows in shades of pink and gold. Grace woke and crunded, and Xander picked her up with surprising gentleness for such large hands. He held her while Eleanor heated milk on the small spirit lamp Mrs. Calloway had left, watched as the baby drank and settled, tiny fists uncurling. In that moment, with the infant warm against his chest and Eleanor's grateful eyes watching from the bed, Alexander Sterling understood something he had been running from for 4 years. In that moment, with the infant warm against his chest and Eleanor's grateful eyes watching from the bed, Alexander Sterling understood what 4 years of isolation had hidden from him. Purpose did not come from accumulation. It came from protection, from standing between the vulnerable and the violence that sought to destroy them. It came from choosing, again and again, to be present when it mattered most. Outside, the world was waking up. Somewhere in that world, Silas Bennett was planning his next move. Somewhere, wheels were turning, laws were being twisted, and powerful men were preparing to teach an upstart millionaire a lesson about interfering in matters that weren't his concern. Let them come. Xander had failed once. He would not fail again. He looked down at Grace, at her tiny, perfect face, and made a silent promise. The same promise he had made to Victoria and Samuel 4 years too late. I will protect you, whatever it costs, however long it takes. This time I will not fail. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, but James Jr. made no move to add wood. He sat transfixed, the whiskey glass warming between his palms, watching his grandfather's face shift between shadow and fading light. Outside, the autumn wind of 1922 rattled the windows, but neither man noticed. Old Xander stood slowly, joints protesting with the particular ache of 75 years hard-lived. He crossed to the window, placed one weathered hand against the cold glass. You know what separates a rich man from a powerful man, boy? James Jr. shook his head. Allies, and the will to spend everything you have to protect what matters. Xander turned back, eyes distant. Let me show you how I built mine. The old man returned to his chair, and the past rose up again like smoke. Dawn broke cold and clear over Sterling Manor on December 16, 1879. Xander had not slept. He sat in the chair beside Victoria's bed, Winchester across his lap, watching Eleanor and Grace breathe in the pale morning light. Every sound in the house made his hand drift toward the rifle, every creak of settling timber, every whisper of wind against stone. At 7, Mrs. Calloway knocked softly. Xander unlocked the door, accepted the breakfast tray she offered. Eggs, bacon, fresh bread, coffee that smelled like salvation. The old woman's eyes took in his rumpled clothes, the gun, the watchful exhaustion etched into his face. Mr. Sterling, you can't guard them every moment. Watch me. She sighed, the sound of someone who had known him long enough to recognize immovable determination when she saw it. At least eat something and change your shirt. You smell like fear and gunpowder. After she left, Xander ate standing up, eyes never leaving the window. His mind was already working, calculating, planning. Silas would not simply give up and disappear. Men like that never did. Pride and possession ran deeper than reason, which meant Xander needed leverage, information, the kind of weapons that did not require bullets. He needed a professional. By 9 o'clock, Xander had washed, changed into clean clothes, and made his decision. He found Mrs. Calloway in the kitchen, gave her instructions for Eleanor's care, and headed for the stable. 20 minutes later, he was riding toward Dry Hollow on his black gelding, a horse that cost more than most men earned in a year. The town looked different in daylight. Last night's snow had transformed Main Street into something almost beautiful, covering the mud and horse droppings with pristine white. But beauty was fragile in places like this. By noon, wagon wheels and boot traffic would churn it all back into frozen slush. Xander did not stop at the general store or the land office or any of the other establishments where his presence would draw attention. Instead, he rode straight through town, heading for the telegraph office at the train depot. The operator, a thin man named Wesley Pike, looked up from his desk with the particular mix of deference and greed that wealthy men inspired in those who survived on tips. Mr. Sterling, what can I do for you this morning? Xander laid a $20 gold piece on the counter. Wesley's eyes widened. I need you to send a wire to Denver, to the Pinkerton agency office. Tell them Alexander Sterling requires their best investigator for a confidential matter. Money is no object. I need someone here within 3 days. Wesley's fingers flew across the telegraph key, translating words into the dots and dashes that would race along copper wire all the way to Colorado. When he finished, he looked up. Anything else, sir? Yes, you never saw me this morning. Another gold piece joined the first. Wesley nodded, understanding perfectly. Discretion, like information, had a price. By the time Xander returned to Sterling Manor, Eleanor was awake and sitting by the window with Grace in her arms. She had bathed, dressed in one of Victoria's simpler gowns, and pulled her dark hair back from her bruised face. The swelling around her eye had gone down slightly, revealing the woman beneath the damage. Young, 22, maybe 23, with the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from years of surviving rather than living. She looked up when Xander entered, something like relief crossing her features. I thought maybe you'd changed your mind, decided I was too much trouble. I don't change my mind once it's made. Xander crossed to the window, stood beside her. How are you feeling? Like I was beaten half to death 2 days ago. She managed a thin smile. But alive, which is more than I expected. Grace stirred in her arms, making small sounds. Eleanor shifted the baby to her shoulder, patting gently. Xander watched, struck by how natural the gesture seemed despite everything this woman had endured. I sent for someone, he said, an investigator. He'll be here in a few days. Eleanor's eyes sharpened. Why? Because I need to know everything about Silas Bennett. Every place he's lived, every woman he's hurt, every law he's broken. If we're going to fight him in court, we need ammunition. Court, Eleanor's voice rose slightly. Mr. Sterling, you can't take this to court. He's my husband. The law says I'm his property. No judge will rule against a man's right to his own wife. Then we change what the law sees. We show them he's not a husband. He's a killer. Eleanor stared at him, something breaking open in her expression. Hope, fragile and dangerous as new ice. You really mean it? You're actually going to fight for us? I mean it. She looked down at Grace, tears sliding silent down her cheeks. Not the tears of despair Xander had seen last night, but something different. The tears of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand beside them instead of over them. Thank you, she whispered. Xander said nothing. Words felt inadequate to the moment. Instead, he simply nodded and left her to her crying and her healing, both of which she had earned. The telegram arrived late on December 17th. Thomas McKenna, formerly of the Pinkerton Agency, now running his own private investigation firm out of Denver. Available immediately. Rate of $100 per week plus expenses. Xander wired back. Double your rate if you arrive within 48 hours. McKenna arrived in 36. He rode up to Sterling Manor on the afternoon of December 18th, a compact man in his mid-40s with shrewd eyes and the weathered look of someone who had spent years tracking things that did not want to be found. Xander met him in the study, a room lined with account books and mining reports, and the accumulated evidence of a fortune built from rock and sweat. Mr. Sterling, McKenna's handshake was firm, professional. Your wire suggested urgency. It did. Xander gestured to a chair. How much do you know about Wyoming domestic law? Enough to know it favors the husband in almost every circumstance. Then you understand the problem. I'm harboring another man's wife. She ran from him 2 nights ago with their newborn daughter. He beat her nearly to death for birthing a girl instead of a boy. McKenna's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps. He had seen this before. And you want me to find grounds for legal separation or divorce? No, Xander leaned forward. I want you to find proof that Silas Bennett is a serial killer. I want every woman he's married, every child who died under suspicious circumstances, every town he's lived in, and every reason he left. I want enough evidence to hang him, and I want it in 4 days. McKenna whistled low. That's a tall order. I'll pay $1,000, cash, plus $200 for expenses, and a $500 bonus if you deliver in 3 days instead of 4. The investigator's eyes narrowed, calculating. $1,500 was more than most working men saw in 5 years. You must want this man badly. I want justice for Eleanor and her daughter, and for my wife and son, who died 4 years ago in a fire that wasn't an accident. Understanding dawned in McKenna's face. You think Bennett was involved? I know he was. I just need proof. McKenna stood, extended his hand again. I'll start tonight. But Mr. Sterling, you need to understand something. If I find what you're looking for, it's going to get ugly. Men like Bennett don't go quietly. And the law doesn't always care what the evidence says when reputation and money are involved. Then it's fortunate I have more money than anyone else in this territory. McKenna smiled, sharp and knowing. I believe we'll work well together. After the investigator left, Xander sat alone in his study, staring at the account books that represented his life's work. $2.3 million. 3 gold mines pulling wealth from the earth with mechanical efficiency. Railroad shares that paid dividends, whether he thought about them or not. Land that increased in value simply by existing. All of it meaningless unless it could be used to protect 2 people who had stumbled into his carefully maintained isolation and reminded him what it felt like to care whether someone lived or died. He opened the ledger, dipped his pen in ink, and made a notation in the column reserved for extraordinary expenses. McKenna investigation, $1,000. Legal retainer, $5,000. Miscellaneous protective measures, $10,000. $16,000 committed in the span of 2 days. Enough to buy a small ranch, a fleet of wagons, a lifetime of comfort for a family willing to live modestly. Xander did not hesitate. He signed his name with a flourish and closed the book. Money was just paper and promises. Eleanor and Grace were flesh and blood, and the chance to prove that wealth could be used for something other than its own multiplication. Day 3 brought a blizzard that buried Dry Hollow under 2 feet of snow and made travel impossible. Xander spent the day in Eleanor's room, keeping the fire high, watching Grace sleep and learning the shape of his new responsibilities. Eleanor was stronger now. The bruises had faded from black to purple to yellow-green. Her ribs still hurt when she breathed deeply, but the sharp edge of pain had dulled to a constant ache. She could walk across the room without gasping, could hold Grace without her arms trembling from exhaustion. They did not speak much. Eleanor seemed to understand that Xander was not a man comfortable with prolonged conversation. Instead, they existed in companionable silence, broken only by Grace's occasional cries or Mrs. Calloway's periodic arrivals with food and supplies. But late in the afternoon, as the blizzard howled outside and the fire cast dancing shadows across the walls, Eleanor asked the question Xander had been dreading. Why didn't you remarry after your wife died? Xander was quiet for a long moment. Then carefully he answered, because I couldn't protect the first one. Didn't seem fair to promise protection to another woman when I'd already failed once. That's not fair to yourself. Maybe not, but it's honest. Eleanor adjusted Grace against her shoulder. Mrs. Calloway told me about the fire. She said you were in Cheyenne when it happened, that there was nothing you could have done. There's always something you can do. I chose business over family, chose a contract signing over one more night at home, and they paid for my choice with their lives. You can't know that. I can, because if I'd been here, Victoria and Samuel would have lived. The man who set that fire only succeeded because the house was vulnerable, because I wasn't standing guard. He looked at Eleanor directly, letting her see the guilt he had carried for 4 years. So no, I didn't remarry, and I won't, because the only way I can live with what happened is to make sure it never happens again. To anyone. Eleanor held his gaze, and in her eyes Xander saw understanding, the kind that came only from surviving the unsurvivable. Then we're both ghosts, she said quietly, haunting the lives we should have had. Maybe, but ghosts can still do some good in the world. Night fell early, the way it did in winter, darkness pressing against the windows by 5 o'clock. Xander lit the lamps, stoked the fire, and settled into his now familiar position in the chair between bed and cradle. Eleanor tried to convince him to sleep in his own room, but he refused with the same quiet stubbornness he applied to everything. Around midnight, Grace woke crying. Not the usual fussy sounds of hunger or discomfort, but something sharper, more urgent. Eleanor picked her up, and even in the dim lamplight, Xander could see the flush spreading across the baby's face. She's burning up. Eleanor's voice cracked with panic. She pressed her hand to Grace's forehead, then her cheeks, her tiny chest. Oh God, no, not her too. Please, not her too. Xander was beside them in an instant. He touched Grace's skin, felt the heat radiating from her small body. Fever, high and climbing. When did this start? I don't know. She was fine an hour ago when she nursed. But now she's so hot, and she won't stop crying. And oh God, what if she dies like the others? What if I lose her too? What if... Eleanor. Xander caught her shoulders, made her look at him. Breathe, she's not going to die. You don't know that. Anne had fever. She died in 2 days. What if Grace... Grace is not Anne. She's stronger, and she has something Anne didn't have. What? A doctor, and medicine, and people who won't let her slip away. He took Grayson from Eleanor's arms, cradling the burning infant against his chest. The baby's cries had weakened to whimpers, her small body limp with fever. Xander had seen pneumonia before war in the mining camps where men worked in wet cold and died coughing blood. He had seen how fast it could take a strong man, how much faster it could take a child. But he had also seen people survive with proper care. He carried Grace to the washstand, soaked a cloth in cool water, and pressed it gently to her forehead. The baby, startled at the cold, cried harder for a moment, then settled into exhausted quiet. Keep her cool, not cold, just enough to bring the fever down. Xander handed the cloth to Eleanor. I'm going to get the medicine chest. He found it in the library where Mrs. Calloway had stored it after that first night. Victorian's medicine chest, oak and brass, lined with blue velvet and filled with the remedies she had collected over the years. Willow bark powder for pain, camphor oil for congestion, honey and lemon for cough, laudanum for when nothing else would work. Xander carried it back upstairs, moving with the careful haste of a man who understood that minutes mattered. In the bedroom, Eleanor had stripped Grace down to her diaper, was sponging her tiny body with cool water while tears ran unchecked down her own face. She's so small, so fragile. I can't lose her. I can't. You won't. Xander mixed willow bark powder with warm water, added a touch of honey to make it palatable, used a clean cloth to let drops fall into Grace's mouth. The baby coughed, sputtered, but swallowed. Again and again. Patient, gentle. The way Victoria had shown him when Samuel had been sick with croup. Then he took Grace from Eleanor, held the infant upright against his shoulder, and began to walk, back and forth across the room. Slow, steady steps, keeping her upright so the congestion in her lungs would not pool, keeping her moving so her small body would not give up and surrender to the fever's pull. Eleanor watched from the bed, exhausted and terrified. How do you know what to do? My son, he got sick when he was 2. Fever, cough. Victoria sat up with him for 3 nights straight, doing exactly this. Walking, cooling, making sure he kept breathing. Xander's voice was soft, distant. He lived. And I learned that sometimes the difference between living and dying is just one person refusing to give up. Hours passed. Xander walked. Grace's fever climbed, peaked, then slowly began to fall. By 4 in the morning, her skin was merely warm instead of burning. Her breathing had eased. Her eyes, when they fluttered open, looked clearer. Eleanor had fallen asleep sitting up against the headboard, exhaustion finally overcoming fear. Xander continued walking until dawn painted the windows pink, until Grace's fever had broken completely and she was sleeping peacefully in his arms. Only then did he lower himself carefully back into the chair, the baby still cradled against his chest. His back ached. His legs trembled from hours of constant motion. But Grace was alive and breathing steady, and that was all that mattered. Mrs. Calloway found them that way when she arrived with breakfast. Xander asleep in the chair, Grace asleep against his shoulder, Eleanor asleep in the bed, all 3 of them alive and healing in a room that had once held only death and memory. The old woman smiled, set down the tray without making a sound, and left them to their peace. In the leather chair beside the dying embers, old Xander poured himself another measure of whiskey. His hands had stopped shaking. Or maybe he had just grown accustomed to the tremor. Hard to tell after 75 years. James Jr. leaned forward. Did she live? Grace? Xander's eyes crinkled. Boy, your father James is Grace's younger brother. What do you think? The boy flushed, embarrassed by his own momentary forgetting. Right, Sorry, it's just the way you tell it. I forget this all happened before I was born. That's because it shaped everything that came after. Xander drained his glass. Now comes the hard part. The part where I learned that sometimes you have to become the thing you despise to protect what you love. He closed his eyes, and the past rushed back. Thomas McKenna returned to Sterling Manor on the morning of December 21st. His horse lathered despite the cold. Xander met him in the study, saw the look on the investigator's face, and knew before a word was spoken that McKenna had found something terrible. Talk. McKenna laid a leather folder on the desk, opened it to reveal pages of notes, photographs, official documents. His voice was flat, professional, but anger simmered beneath the surface. Silas Bennett is 44 years old, born in Missouri, 1835. Father was a trapper. Mother died when Silas was 12. No record of formal education. First marriage was 1858 when he was 23. Woman named Sarah Cole, age 17. They had two daughters. Both died before their first birthday. Cause of death listed as fever on the certificates, but the local doctor noted suspicious bruising on both infants. Xander's jaw tightened. Go on. 1860, Sarah Cole disappeared. No body ever found. Silas moved to Kansas, married Mary Thompson in 1862. 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, all dead by 1865. The boy supposedly drowned. The girls died of untreated illness. McKenna flipped pages, each one a catalog of horror. Mary Thompson died in 1866, fell down a well, according to the sheriff's report. But the well was only 30 feet deep and had a ladder. Hard to fall accidentally. Silas moved to Colorado, married Charlotte Reed in 1868 under the name Samuel Black. 2 sons, both dead by 1870. James drowned in a creek. Henry fell down the stairs. Let me guess, Charlotte ran. In 1873, escaped in the middle of the night, Silas told everyone she had died of cholera, moved back to Wyoming to a different county, married Eleanor Bennett's older sister Margaret in 1874 under his real name. Margaret was 19, had 1 daughter. Child died at 3 months. Margaret herself died 6 months later. Cause of death listed as complications from childbirth, but she hadn't been pregnant. The investigator's voice had gone cold as stone. Silas married Eleanor in 1876. She was 16. Her father received $200 and a mule. Eleanor has had 4 daughters, 3 dead, 1 alive only because she ran. Xander stood, moved to the window, stared out at snow that looked clean and pure and hid the ugliness of the world beneath. 11 children, 4 women, 15 years, and nobody stopped him. Nobody cared enough to look. He moved counties, changed names, and the law treated each incident as isolated. Accidents, tragedy, the natural order of a hard world. Natural. Xander's voice was bitter. There's nothing natural about murdering infants because they're the wrong gender. No, but there's something else. McKenna opened another folder. I found evidence connecting Silas to your wife's death. Xander turned sharply. Show me. McKenna laid out a series of documents. Employment records from the Silverbrook mine showing Silas Bennett hired as a security guard in 1874, fired in 1870 for assaulting a female cook. A complaint filed by Victoria Sterling in November 1875, stating that Silas had come to her home demanding money and threatening her husband. And a witness statement, never filed officially, from a ranch hand who had seen Silas near Sterling Manor on the night of December 10th, 1875, the night of the fire. The ranch hand, a man named Robert Hayes, told me he saw Silas riding away from your property around midnight. Said he thought it was strange because there was smoke coming from one of the upper windows. But Hayes didn't report it because he was poaching your deer and didn't want trouble. Xander's hands curled into fists. Silas killed them. Almost certainly. Victoria rejected him, threatened to tell you about his advances. So he waited until you were gone and locked them in their bedroom. Set the fire in the library where it would spread slowly enough that no one would suspect arson, but fast enough that they couldn't escape. The room went silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Xander stood frozen, 4 years of grief and guilt crystallizing into something sharp and cold and utterly implacable. Where is this ranch hand now? I've got him in a hotel in Cheyenne. Cost me $50 to convince him to testify, but he'll do it. Good. Xander turned back to McKenna. Find every woman Silas ever hurt. Every witness to every crime. I want them here, all of them. I'll pay travel, lodging, lost wages, whatever it takes. And I want this done in 5 days. McKenna whistled low. That's going to cost you thousands. I have millions. Start spending them. The investigator gathered his papers. At the door, he paused. Mr. Sterling, you're declaring war on a system that has protected men like Bennett for generations. Are you sure you're ready for what that means? Xander met his eyes. 4 years ago, I asked myself what my wealth was for. Today, I have an answer. It's for this, for justice that the law won't provide, for protection that society refuses to give, for making sure one more monster doesn't walk free. McKenna nodded once. Then let's burn it all down. Over the next week, Sterling Manor transformed from a mausoleum into a fortress. Xander hired 2 ranch hands to patrol the grounds at night, installed new locks on every door and window, moved Eleanor and Grace to an interior room with no outside walls and only one entrance, which he could guard directly. And he began his campaign. First, he rode to Cheyenne and retained Samuel Harrison, the most expensive lawyer in the territory. $5,000 up front. Harrison had defended railroad barons and mining magnates, had won cases against the territorial government itself. He was cold, brilliant, and utterly without sentiment about anything except winning. Mr. Sterling, I'll be frank. The law is not on your side. A man's wife is his property under Wyoming statute. Domestic discipline is considered his right. Unless you can prove attempted murder with unimpeachable evidence, no judge will rule in your favor. Then we prove attempted murder. Harrison raised an eyebrow. Can you? I can prove serial murder. 11 children, 3 women, all killed by the same man over 15 years. The lawyer's expression sharpened. Now that is interesting. Get me the evidence, and I'll build you a case that will hang him. Second, Xander went to war economically. Judge Nathaniel Whitmore owned the Bank of Dry Hollow, a modest institution that survived primarily on Xander's deposits. $150,000 in payment and gold certificates, enough to fund the bank's lending operations and provide liquidity for the town's businesses. On December 23rd, Xander walked into the bank and requested the complete withdrawal of his funds. The bank manager, a nervous man named Fletcher, paled. Mr. Sterling, we don't keep that much cash on hand. It would take weeks to arrange. You have 3 days. Wire to Cheyenne, Denver if you have to. But by December 26th, I want every dollar transferred to First National of Cheyenne. But sir, that will cripple our operations. We have outstanding loans, businesses depending on. That's not my concern. You have 3 days. Within hours, panic spread through Dry Hollow. The bank scrambled to call in loans. 5 businesses, sensing instability, withdrew their own accounts. By the next morning, Judge Whitmore's institution was on the brink of collapse. The judge himself arrived at Sterling Manor on Christmas Eve, red-faced and furious. Sterling, what the hell do you think you're doing? Xander met him on the front steps, deliberately not inviting him inside. Business, Your Honor. Surely you understand the concept. This is retaliation for the silver mine exposure. You're trying to destroy me. No, I'm simply moving my money to a bank I trust. If that causes you difficulties, perhaps you should have built a more stable institution. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. This is about the Bennett woman. You're harboring a fugitive wife, and you're using your money to prevent legal consequences. Eleanor Bennett is a guest in my home. If her husband has complaints, he can bring them to court, which I believe he's attempting to do. And you think your money will win that fight? Xander smiled, cold and sharp. Money doesn't win fights, Your Honor. Evidence does. I just happen to have enough money to make sure all the evidence gets seen. The judge left in a fury, and Xander returned inside knowing he had just made a powerful enemy. But he had also sent a message. Anyone who stood with Silas Bennett would face economic consequences. In a territory where wealth meant power, Xander had more wealth than anyone, and he was willing to spend every dollar to protect 2 people who had no power at all. Charlotte Reed arrived on December 26th, driven in a hired coach from Dry Hollow. She was 28 years old, thin as winter wind, with eyes that had seen too much and forgotten none of it. When Eleanor saw her, something broke open in both women. They embraced in the front hall of Sterling Manor, crying without shame. Two survivors recognizing each other across the years. "I thought I was alone," Eleanor whispered. "So did I," Charlotte answered. Margaret Walsh, now Margaret Thornton, after marrying the Reverend who had turned Eleanor away, arrived the next day. She was pale and shaking, terrified of what her testimony would cost her. But she came anyway, driven by the weight of carrying secrets that had poisoned her soul for 15 years. Aaron Bennett, Silas's younger brother, rode in from Montana on December 28th, 38 years old, weathered by ranch work and guilt. He had not seen his brother in 20 years, but he remembered what Silas had been as a boy. Cruel, violent, incapable of seeing other people as anything more than objects to be used or broken. "He killed our family dog when he was 14, Aaron told Xander. "Beat it to death with a fence post because it had barked at him. My father threw him out, said no son of his would grow into that kind of man, but Silas didn't care. He just left and started hurting people elsewhere." By December 30th, Xander had assembled an army. 8 witnesses, 2 lawyers, an investigator with a file 3 inches thick, and enough money to make sure every single piece of evidence would be seen, heard, and recorded. But Silas had not been idle either. Marcus Whitmore, the judge's son and a lawyer in his own right, had taken Silas's case personally, not because he believed in Silas's innocence, but because he saw an opportunity to destroy Alexander Sterling, the man who had exposed his father's corruption and cost their family $80,000. And on the night of December 30th, while Xander sat in the study reviewing legal documents, Silas Bennett made his move. The first sign was the smell of smoke. Xander was on his feet instantly, Winchester in hand. He threw open the study door and saw flames licking up the library curtains. A bottle, shattered glass, the stink of kerosene. Molotov cocktail, thrown through the same window Silas had broken 10 days earlier. "Fire!" as Xander's voice carried through the house. "Everyone out!" Mrs. Calloway appeared on the stairs, eyes wide. "Mr. Sterling, get Eleanor and Grace to the root cellar. Now, lock yourself in and don't come out until I say it's safe. But the fire, I'll handle the fire. Just get them safe." The old woman fled. Xander heard her pounding on doors, heard Eleanor's frightened voice, heard the quick footsteps of people moving with purpose toward the back of the house. Good. The cellar was stone, underground, separate from the main structure. Even if the entire manor burned, they would survive there. Xander turned back to the library. The fire had spread to the bookshelves now, feeding on decades of accumulated paper. He grabbed a bucket of sand from the hearth, threw it on the flames, another bucket. The fire hissed, shrank, but did not die. Then he heard the crash of more glass. The dining room this time. More fire. This was not desperation. This was strategy. Silas was burning him out. Xander moved to the gun cabinet in the entry hall, pulled out a second Winchester and a box of ammunition. Loaded both rifles. This was no longer about property. This was about survival. He opened the front door, stepped out onto the porch, and saw them. 4 men on horseback, Silas in the lead, another bottle burning in his hand. "Come out, Sterling!" Silas's voice was raw with whiskey and rage. "You got my wife in there. My daughter. They're mine, and I'm taking them back, even if I have to burn you out like you burned me out of my job." Xander raised the Winchester, sighted down the barrel at center mass. "You throw that bottle, and I'll put a bullet through your heart. You ain't got the stones. Try me." For a moment, the world hung suspended. 4 men against 1. But that one man stood on his own property, defending his own home, with the law of castle doctrine on his side. And that one man had spent years dealing with claim jumpers and labor agitators and all the violence that came with building wealth in hostile territory. Silas's companions shifted nervously. They had signed up for intimidation, maybe some property damage. Not a firefight with a millionaire who had killed claim jumpers before and would certainly do it again. "Silas, man, this ain't worth it." "Shut up!" Silas raised the burning bottle. "This ends tonight." The bottle left his hand in a graceful arc, flames trailing behind like a comet. Xander's finger tightened on the trigger. The shot cracked across the frozen night like a thunderclap. The bottle exploded in midair, showering burning kerosene harmlessly onto snow 30 feet from the house. Silas's horse reared, dumping him into a snowdrift. The other men wheeled their mounts ready to flee. But before anyone could move, more riders appeared. Sheriff Parker and two deputies, drawn by the smoke and gunfire. And behind them, torch-carrying citizens from Dry Hollow, roused from their Christmas celebrations by news that Sterling Manor was under attack. Parker drew his revolver, pointed it at Silas. "Silas Bennett, you're under arrest for arson and attempted murder." "He's got my wife." "Don't care, you just tried to burn down a man's home with people inside. That's attempted murder in any court." The deputies dragged Silas to his feet, snapped iron cuffs around his wrists. As they hauled him toward a wagon, Silas turned back to Xander with eyes full of venom. "This ain't over, Sterling. I'll get them back. I'll see you dead. I'll burn everything you love to ash and laugh while it burns." Xander did not respond. He simply stood on his porch, Winchester still smoking in his hands, and watched as the law finally did what it should have done years ago. Arrest the monster. In the crowd of townspeople, Xander saw faces he recognized. Men who worked in his mines, women who shopped at stores his money supported, and most importantly, witnesses. 24 people who had just watched Silas Bennett try to burn a house full of innocent people. 24 people who could testify. The fire inside had died, smothered by the sand Xander had thrown. Minimal damage, nothing that could not be repaired. But the damage to Silas's case was irreparable. Parker approached the porch, holstering his weapon. "Mr. Sterling, I'll need a statement." "You'll get one, but first I need to check on my guests." He found Eleanor and Grace in the root cellar with Mrs. Calloway, Charlotte, and Margaret. All of them alive. All of them safe. Eleanor was crying, clutching Grace so tightly the baby had started to fuss. "Is he gone?" she whispered. "He's arrested, in custody, and this time there's no getting out of it. 20 witnesses saw him throw that bottle. He confessed to everything in front of the entire town." Eleanor's legs gave out. Charlotte caught her, held her while she sobbed with relief and terror and the slow dawning realization that maybe, impossibly, this nightmare might actually end. Xander looked at the women huddled together in the cold cellar, at Grace crying in her mother's arms, at Mrs. Calloway standing guard with a kitchen knife clutched in her hand. These were the people worth fighting for. Not wealth, not reputation, not the approval of society or the respect of powerful men. Just people, broken and scared and desperately hoping that the world might contain one more scrap of justice. "It's over," he said quietly. "Silas will stand trial, and this time the whole territory will know what he is." They climbed the stairs back into the house. The library smelled of smoke and sand and the bitter tang of kerosene, but Sterling Manor still stood. And in that moment, Xander understood that this house, which had been a tomb for 4 years, had finally become something else, a fortress, a sanctuary, a place where the powerless could find power, and where one wealthy man could learn that the true measure of fortune was not what you owned, but what you were willing to spend to protect what mattered. The whiskey bottles sat empty between them now. James Jr. had stopped sipping, too engrossed in his grandfather's tale to remember the glass cooling in his hand. Outside, the November wind of 1922 had died to a whisper, and the first pale light of dawn was beginning to paint the eastern sky. Old Xander stood slowly, bones creaking with the particular protest of a body that had lived hard and long. He walked to the fireplace, placed his weathered hands on the mantel, and stared into the ashes. "The trial lasted 3 days, boy, but I remember every minute of it like it happened yesterday, because that's when I learned something important about justice." He turned, eyes bright despite the exhaustion etched into his face. "It doesn't matter how much money you have, how much evidence you gather, how many witnesses you bring. In the end, justice only happens when ordinary people decide to give a damn." James Jr. leaned forward. "Did they convict him?" "Let me tell you how it happened. January 2nd, 1880. The courthouse in Dry Hollow had never seen a crowd like this. 300 people packed into a building meant to hold half that number. They stood in the aisles pressed against the walls, craned their necks from the doorway to catch a glimpse of what everyone was calling the trial of the decade. Xander arrived early, before the sun had fully risen, while frost still glittered on the courthouse steps. He wore his best suit, dark wool that cost more than most men earned in a month. But he had deliberately chosen simplicity over ostentation. Today was not about displaying wealth. Today was about displaying truth. Eleanor sat beside him in the front row, Charlotte on her other side. Both women wore plain dresses borrowed from Mrs. Calloway, their hair pulled back in simple styles. No jewelry, no adornment, just two survivors preparing to tell the world what survival had cost. Behind them sat Margaret Thornton, hands trembling in her lap, Aaron Bennett, face set like stone, Dr. Morrison, who had documented Eleanor's injuries, and a dozen others, each one carrying a piece of the puzzle that would either condemn Silas or set him free. The prosecution table held District Attorney James Hartley and Samuel Harrison, the lawyers Xander had hired. Hartley was a political appointee, competent but cautious. Harrison was a shark in expensive clothing, all cold calculation and ruthless precision. The defense table held Marcus Whitmore alone. He sat with calculated casualness, projecting confidence he might or might not feel. Beside him, in iron shackles, sat Silas Bennett. Cleaned up, sober, wearing a borrowed suit, Silas looked almost respectable. The kind of weathered, hardworking man who might inspire sympathy from a jury. Marcus had done his job well, transformed a monster into a victim of circumstance. Xander studied the jury. 12 men as required by territorial law. 10 ranchers and small business owners. 2 women, which was rare but not unheard of in Wyoming, where women had won the right to vote and serve on juries in 1869. The women's faces were carefully neutral. The men's ranged from hostile to curious to bored. These were the people who would decide whether Silas Bennett walked free or hanged. These ordinary citizens who had their own troubles and their own biases and their own ideas about what a man owed his wife and what a wife owed her husband in return. Judge Nathaniel Whitmore presided, his face carefully blank despite the rage Xander knew simmered beneath. The judge had tried to recuse himself, claiming conflict of interest, but the territorial court had denied his request. There was no other judge available, and the case could not be delayed. So Whitmore sat on his bench, gavel in hand, watching his son defend a monster, while the man who had destroyed his bank sat in judgment. The bailiff called the court to order. The noise of 300 people settling into anticipatory silence filled the room like held breath. The territory of Wyoming versus Silas Bennett. Charges of attempted murder, arson, assault with intent to kill, and 11 counts of manslaughter. How does the defendant plead? Marcus Whitmore stood smoothly. Not guilty on all counts, Your Honor. Hartley rose for the prosecution. Your Honor, the territory is prepared to demonstrate that Silas Bennett is a serial killer who has murdered 11 children and 3 women over a span of 15 years. That he attempted to murder his current wife, Eleanor Bennett, and their infant daughter, Grace, and that he attempted to burn Sterling Manor with multiple occupants inside. We have witnesses, physical evidence, and testimony that will prove beyond any doubt that the defendant is a danger to society and should face the maximum penalty under law. Very well. Opening statements. Hartley went first, methodical and precise. The evidence will show a 15-year pattern. 5 marriages, 11 dead children, 3 vanished wives, and 1 woman who survived only because she ran into a blizzard rather than stay another night under her husband's roof. He spoke for 20 minutes, his voice never rising, letting the facts build their own horror. Then Marcus Whitmore stood. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you have just heard is a story, a very compelling story, constructed by wealthy men with unlimited resources and a desire to destroy a simple working man who dared to demand the return of his lawfully wedded wife. His voice was smooth, reasonable, the tone of a man simply asking for fairness. The prosecution would have you believe that Silas Bennett is a monster. But I ask you to consider what the evidence actually shows. A man who has suffered terrible loss, who has buried children alongside every other parent in this hard territory, who knows the pain of infant mortality, who has loved and lost and grieved just like any of you. He gestured towards Silas, who sat with head bowed, the picture of wounded dignity. Is my client perfect? No, he has a temper, he drinks too much, he made mistakes in disciplining his wife. But does any of that make him a murderer? Or does it make him a man broken by grief, lashing out in pain when the woman he loved betrayed him by running to a millionaire who could offer her luxuries my client never could? Marcus let that sink in, saw several jury members nod slightly. The prosecution has money. They have private investigators and expensive lawyers and witnesses who have been paid to travel here and testify. But what they don't have is proof, not real proof, just circumstantial evidence and the word of women who have every reason to lie. He paused, met the eyes of the jury one by one. Before you condemn a man to death, ask yourselves this. In all your years, have you ever known wealth to be used justly against poverty? Or is this simply another case of a rich man crushing a poor man because he can? He sat down. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Whitmore gavelled for order. Xander felt Eleanor tense beside him, felt her fear that the jury might be swayed by Marcus's rhetoric. He wanted to reassure her, but he knew better than to make promises about jury verdicts. 12 strangers could decide anything for any reason. All he could do was make sure they heard the truth. The prosecution calls Dr. Henry Morrison to the stand. Morrison was 62 years old, gray-bearded, with the calm authority of a man who had spent 40 years dealing with birth and death and everything between. He took the oath, settled into the witness chair, and fixed his eyes on Hartley. Dr. Morrison, you examined Eleanor Bennett on the night of December 15th, 1879? I did. Please describe her condition. The doctor pulled out a leather notebook, flipped to the relevant page. 7 broken ribs, 4 on the left side, 3 on the right, fractured cheekbone, severe concussion, internal bleeding in the abdominal cavity, burns on her left shoulder consistent with being pushed against a hot stove, ligature marks on her throat indicating strangulation, and approximately 40 contusions at various stages of healing, suggesting repeated beatings over an extended period. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Several jury members looked ill. In your professional opinion, would these injuries have been fatal without treatment? The internal bleeding alone would have killed her within 12 to 18 hours. Add in hypothermia from exposure, and she would have been dead by dawn. And the infant, Grace Bennett? Severe hypothermia, pneumonia. Without immediate intervention, she would not have survived the night. Hartley held up a photograph, one of the new technologies that was so slowly spreading across the territory. Doctor, can you identify this? That's Eleanor Bennett's back, photographed 2 days after I first examined her. You can see the extensive bruising and several partially healed lacerations consistent with being struck with the belt or strap. The photograph was passed to the jury. Xander watched their faces change as they studied it, saw disgust replace skepticism, saw anger replace indifference. Marcus Whitmore rose for cross-examination, but there was little he could do. Medical evidence was medical evidence. He tried to suggest that Eleanor might have acquired the injuries through some other means, but Dr. Morrison shut that down with professional certainty. In 40 years of practice, I have seen hundreds of injuries. These were caused by another person. There is no doubt in my mind whatsoever. Hartley then called Robert Hayes, the ranch hand who had witnessed Silas near Sterling Manor the night of the fire. Hayes was a weathered man in his 50s, clearly uncomfortable in his Sunday suit. He spoke reluctantly, confessing his poaching, then describing what he had seen. A rider fleeing from the manor around midnight, smoke rising from an upper window, the distinctive profile of Silas Bennett on horseback. Marcus's cross-examination could not shake his testimony. Hayes had nothing to gain and much to lose by coming forward. That made him credible. The prosecution calls Eleanor Bennett to the stand. The courtroom went silent as Eleanor stood. Xander wanted to reach out, offer support, but he kept his hands folded in his lap. This was her moment, her testimony, her chance to be heard after years of enforced silence. Eleanor walked to the witness stand with her head high despite the trembling in her legs. She wore a plain gray dress that made her look younger than her 22 years, made her look like what she was, a girl who had been sold into hell and had somehow survived long enough to crawl out. She took the oath, sat down, and met Hartley's eyes with surprising steadiness. Mrs. Bennett, how old were you when you married Silas? 16. And how did that marriage come about? My father sold me for $200 and a mule. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even Judge Whitmore looked shocked. Your father sold you? Yes, Silas came to our homestead looking for a wife. My father needed money. She paused. I needed somewhere to go. My mother had died. My father drank. Silas seemed like an escape. What was your marriage like? Eleanor's hands clenched in her lap. For the first month, it was tolerable. Then I got pregnant. Silas was happy, said he wanted a son to help with trapping and hunting. When I gave birth to Anne, a daughter, he stopped talking to me for 3 days. What happened to Anne? She got fever at 2 weeks old. I begged Silas to fetch the doctor. He said doctors cost money and babies either lived or died on their own. Anne died on the 4th day of fever. Several women in the gallery were openly crying. Eleanor continued, her voice flat, drained of emotion by sheer necessity. I got pregnant again. Had Mary, another daughter. This time Silas was angry before she was born. Said I was cursed. Said God was punishing him through me. When I was 7 months pregnant, I burned his dinner because I was so tired I could barely stand. He beat me until I couldn't walk. 3 days later, I went into labor. Mary was born dead. And the third child? Rose. I hid the pregnancy as long as I could, wore loose dresses, didn't tell him, but he figured it out eventually, started drinking more, said if it was another girl, he'd throw it in the river. Eleanor's voice cracked, but she forced herself to continue. Rose was born alive, beautiful, perfect. She cried so loud, and Silas looked at her, saw she was a girl, and just picked her up and threw her against the wall. Like she was a sack of grain, not a baby, not his daughter, just garbage. The courtroom had gone absolutely still. Even the reporters had stopped writing, frozen in horror. Rose died in my arms an hour later. I tried to save her, tried to stop the bleeding, but she was so small and the injury was so severe. She just slipped away. Did you report these deaths to any authority? I tried. Went to the sheriff after Rose died. He said a man had the right to discipline his household. That if I'd been a better wife, maybe my babies would have lived. Told me to go home and pray harder. What about the church? Reverend Thornton said the same thing, that a wife must submit to her husband in all things, that my suffering was God's will. Judge Whitmore shifted uncomfortably on his bench. Several jury members were glaring openly at Silas now. And Grace, your fourth daughter? I got pregnant again last year. I prayed every day for a son, not because I wanted a boy more than a girl, but because I knew a girl wouldn't survive. When Grace was born 3 days before Christmas, I knew immediately. I could see it in Silas's face. He started drinking, and that night he came at me with his fists. She touched her ribs reflexively. He said I was worthless, said I couldn't even do the one thing women were made for, said he should have drowned me like a sick dog years ago. Then he started hitting me. I grabbed Grace and ran. Didn't plan it. Didn't think. Just ran into the snow with no coat and no shoes and nowhere to go except away. Why did you go to the church? Because I thought God's house would have mercy. I was wrong. Eleanor looked directly at Reverend Thornton in the gallery. The old man could not meet her eyes. The Reverend opened the door, saw me bleeding with a newborn in my arms, and told me he couldn't interfere in a husband's rights. Then he closed the door and left me to die in the snow. The courtroom exploded in angry murmurs. Judge Whitmore gavelled for order, but even he looked shaken. What happened next? Mr. Sterling found me, took me to his home, saved my life and Grace's life, and then stood between us and Silas even though it cost him money and reputation and safety. She looked at Xander, and her eyes filled with tears for the first time. No man had ever protected me before. No man had ever treated me like I mattered. And now I'm sitting here telling you all of this because Mr. Sterling believed I deserved to be heard, that Grace deserved to live, that justice was more important than custom or law or the rights of men who use those rights to murder. Hartley let that statement hang in the silence. No further questions. Marcus Whitmore approached for cross-examination, but his confidence had visibly diminished. He tried to paint Eleanor as a gold digger who had seduced a wealthy man, tried to suggest she was lying to secure a better life, tried to imply that the injuries might have been exaggerated or self-inflicted. But Eleanor did not break, did not waver. She answered every question with the simple, devastating honesty of someone who had nothing left to lose. Finally, Marcus asked the question he should have left alone. Mrs. Bennet, if your husband was so terrible, why did you stay for 6 years? Eleanor looked at him with something like pity. Because I had nowhere to go. Because the law said I was his property. Because every authority I turned to told me to submit and pray and accept my suffering as God's will. Because I was 16 years old and alone, and I believed that this was just what marriage was. She leaned forward slightly. But the real question, Mr. Whitmore, is why no one stopped him. I was a child. 3 of my babies died, and not one person with power or authority or the ability to help did anything. So don't ask me why I stayed. Ask yourself why the world let him keep me. The courtroom erupted in applause. Judge Whitmore's gavel barely restored order. When Eleanor stepped down from the witness stand, she walked past Silas without looking at him, walked back to her seat beside Xander with her head high and her shoulders straight. She had spoken her truth. Now it was up to 12 strangers to decide if truth mattered more than tradition. The trial's second day brought Charlotte Reed and Margaret Thornton to the stand. Charlotte described her 2 dead sons with a mother's grief that could not be faked. Margaret, voice shaking but resolute, described the rape that had nearly destroyed her life and the cowardice that had let Silas continue hurting others. Aaron Bennett provided the final blow, describing his brother's cruelty from childhood onward. Describing the family dog beaten to death, the sister made barren by violence, the pattern of brutality that had started before Silas was even a man. My brother isn't broken by grief, Aaron said flatly. He creates grief, and he's been doing it his whole life. The prosecution rested on the afternoon of the second day. The evidence was overwhelming. 3 women with identical stories, 11 dead children, a pattern stretching back 15 years, medical testimony, photographs, witness statements from the night Silas attacked Sterling Manor. But Marcus Whitmore was a skilled attorney. On the 3rd day, he presented his defense with calculated precision. He called Silas to the stand. The monster cleaned up well, shaved, sober, wearing his borrowed suit. Silas looked like a weathered working man betrayed by forces beyond his control. Marcus walked him through a carefully constructed narrative of grief and loss. Yes, his children had died, but infant mortality was common in the harsh Wyoming territory. Yes, he had disciplined his wife, but a man had the right to maintain order in his household. Yes, he had drunk too much, but who wouldn't, watching child after child die despite his best efforts? And yes, he had tried to get Eleanor back, but only because he loved her, missed her, wanted his family whole again. Mr. Bennett, did you ever intentionally harm any of your children? Never. I loved every one of them, buried them with my own hands, and cried over every grave. It was a masterful performance. Several jury members looked uncertain again, swayed by the image of a grieving father rather than a calculating killer. Then Hartley rose for cross-examination. Mr. Bennett, you testified that you loved your children. I did, still do. Then why didn't you give them names? Silas blinked, thrown by the question. What? According to Eleanor's testimony, you refused to let her name your daughters, refused to have them baptized, refused to mark their graves with anything but rocks. Is that the behavior of a loving father? I was in shock, grieving, couldn't think straight. For 6 years? You couldn't think straight for 6 entire years? Silas's composure began to crack. It was hard. You don't understand how hard. Let me ask you about the night of December 30th. You threw a Molotov cocktail at Sterling Manor. Why? To get my family back. By burning them alive? No, I just wanted to scare Sterling. Make him give me back what was mine. And on December 15th, when you broke into Sterling Manor through the library window, what were you looking for? Silas hesitated, just for a second, but that second was enough. I wanted to talk to Eleanor, convince her to come home. Really? Because you were trying to open Mr. Sterling's safe when he found you. What was in that safe that you needed for a conversation with your wife? I wasn't. I don't. Hartley moved closer, his voice dropping to something cold and precise. Mr. Bennett, did you kill Victoria Sterling and her son Samuel? The courtroom went absolutely silent. No, that's a lie. Then why were you at Sterling Manor on the night of December 10th, 1875? I wasn't. We have a witness who saw you riding away from the property at midnight, the same night a fire killed 2 people. That witness is lying. Why would he lie? He has nothing to gain. In fact, he's confessing to poaching on Sterling land, which could get him fined. But he's willing to testify anyway because he saw you, saw smoke, saw you fleeing. Silas was sweating now, his carefully maintained composure crumbling. I didn't kill them. I didn't kill anyone. Then who locked Victoria Sterling's bedroom door from the outside? I don't know. Who set the fire in the library? I don't know. Who left a hunting knife with your initials under the bed? That knife was stolen. Hartley held up the blade, marked with SB and rough scratches. When was it stolen? Years ago, I don't remember exactly. Convenient, almost as convenient as your inability to explain why Victoria Sterling filed a complaint against you 3 weeks before she died, or why you threatened Alexander Sterling's business, or why you've left a trail of dead children and vanished women across 3 territories. Silas stood suddenly, face red with rage. You think you're so smart. You think your words and your evidence mean anything. I am a man. Those women were mine. Those children were mine. I had the right. He stopped, realized what he had just said, but it was too late. The courtroom erupted. Silas had just confirmed everything the prosecution alleged, not through careful questioning, but through his own inability to contain the rage and entitlement that had driven him for 44 years. Judge Whitmore gabbled desperately for order. Deputies moved to restrain Silas, who was shouting now, all pretense of victimhood abandoned. They were mine, all of them. You can't take what's mine. Sterling had no right, no right. They dragged him back to his seat. Marcus Whitmore sat with his head in his hands, knowing his case had just collapsed. Hartley returned to his table, allowing himself a small, satisfied smile. He caught Xander's eye and nodded once. The prosecution rests, Your Honor. The jury deliberated for 45 minutes, not long enough to suggest doubt, long enough to maintain the appearance of serious consideration. When they filed back in, their faces told the story before the foreman spoke. In the case of the Territory of Wyoming versus Silas Bennett, on the charge of first-degree murder of Victoria Sterling, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder of Samuel Sterling, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of attempted murder of Eleanor Bennett, we find the defendant guilty. On 11 counts of manslaughter in the deaths of his children, we find the defendant guilty on all counts. Eleanor collapsed sobbing into Charlotte's arms. Margaret crossed herself and whispered prayers. Aaron Bennett nodded slowly, something like peace settling over his weathered face. Xander sat motionless, feeling 4 years of grief and rage and guilt slowly drain out of him like poison from a wound. Judge Whitmore looked at Silas, and for once, his personal animosity toward Xander did not matter. The evidence was too strong, the confession too damning. Justice, for once, was unavoidable. Silas Bennett, you are hereby sentenced to death by hanging, to be carried out 30 days hence at the Territorial Prison. May God have mercy on your soul, for this court has none. Silas lunged across the defendant's table toward Xander, screaming incoherently. Deputies tackled him, dragged him from the courtroom, still shouting threats and curses that faded as the doors closed behind him. Judge Nathaniel Whitmore remained on his bench after the courtroom emptied, staring at his gavel. His bank had collapsed 2 weeks prior, absorbed by First National of Cheyenne for pennies on the dollar. His son Marcus sat in the empty defense chair, head in hands. The judge understood, finally, that some fights were never winnable. Not against evidence, not against truth, and certainly not against a man willing to spend his entire fortune to protect 2 people who had nothing. Outside, reporters mobbed the steps. Photographers set up their equipment to capture the moment. Headlines were already being written in newsrooms across the territory. But Xander ignored all of it. He stood on the courthouse steps with Eleanor beside him, Grace bundled in her arms, and felt something he had not felt in 4 years. Not happiness, not quite, but something close. Something that felt like the possibility of peace. A reporter called out, "Mr. Sterling, Mr. Sterling, how does it feel to have won?" Xander looked at the man, then at Eleanor, then at the tiny baby who had survived against all odds. "I didn't win anything. Eleanor won, Charlotte won, Margaret won. Every woman who ever survived a man like Silas Bennett won. I just made sure they were heard." He turned to Eleanor. "Come on, let's go home." They walked to his carriage through a crowd that parted respectfully. No more whispers about impropriety, no more speculation about motives. Just quiet acknowledgement that sometimes, rarely, justice actually prevailed. The next 3 months passed in a rhythm of healing. Eleanor grew stronger. Grace grew healthier. Sterling Manor, damaged by fire and violence, was repaired and restored. Xander reopened the ballroom that had been closed since Victoria's death, hosted a charity event that raised $8,000 for battered women, established Victoria's Fund with a $50,000 endowment to provide legal support and safe housing for women escaping violent marriages. The trial's aftermath rippled through Dry Hollow in unexpected ways. Reverend Isaiah Thornton resigned from his pulpit 3 weeks after the verdict, unable to meet the eyes of his congregation. The church board voted unanimously to replace him with Reverend Sarah Mitchell, making her Wyoming's first female pastor. Margaret Thornton, finally free from the weight of her husband's cowardice, became one of Victoria's Fund's most dedicated volunteers. And slowly, carefully, Xander taught himself how to live again. Eleanor learned to read, sitting at the library table every evening while Xander patiently walked her through letters and words and eventually entire books. She planted a garden in the spring, growing vegetables and flowers with equal care, laughed for the first time when Grace grabbed her nose and pulled. On a warm evening in May, Xander found Eleanor in the garden, Grace sleeping in a basket beside her. He had been avoiding this conversation for weeks, but it could not be delayed forever. "Eleanor, I need to ask you something." She looked up, shielding her eyes from the setting sun. "What is it? What do you want? For you and Grace? After everything that's happened, you're free now. Free to go anywhere, do anything. I'll help however I can, but I need to know what you want." Eleanor stood, brushing dirt from her hands. For a long moment, she just looked at him. Then quietly she spoke. "I want to stay. Here? Here with you, if you'll have us." Xander felt his throat tighten. "Eleanor, you don't owe me anything. You don't have to stay out of obligation, or I'm not staying out of obligation." She stepped closer. "I'm staying because for the first time in my life, I feel safe. Because Grace needs a father who won't hurt her. Because you've shown me that men can be kind as well as strong. And because," she paused, gathering courage, "because I love you. Not the desperate love of a woman who needs saving, but the real love of a woman who's seen who you are and wants to spend her life beside you." Xander stood frozen, unable to find words. Everything in him wanted to say yes, to keep them here, safe, protected, to build the family he had lost. But he needed her to understand what that meant. "I'm not an easy man, Eleanor. I work too much. I'm not good with words. And I'll always carry Victoria and Samuel with me. Not as ghosts that need replacing, but as part of who I am. I know, and I'll always carry Anne and Mary and Rose. We're both haunted. But maybe together our ghosts can help us remember what we're living for instead of what we lost." She held out her hand. Xander took it, feeling the calluses from garden work, the strength in her fingers. "Then yes, stay, both of you, for as long as you want. I want forever." Then forever it is. They married in June, a simple ceremony in the garden. Grace, now 6 months old, cooed through the vows. The witnesses were small in number but fierce in loyalty. Charlotte, Margaret, Dr. Morrison, Mrs. Calloway, Aaron Bennett, and Thomas McKenna, the investigator who had started it all. Xander did not give Eleanor Victoria's ring. Instead, he had bought her something new. A simple gold band engraved with words only they would understand. "For Grace and all the daughters who deserve to live." Eleanor cried when she read it. Happy tears for once, the kind that came from joy instead of pain. That night, as they stood on the porch of Sterling Manor watching the sun set over the land that stretched to the horizon, Eleanor asked the question that had been hovering between them for weeks. What happens now? Xander put his arm around her shoulders, careful of her still healing ribs, and smiled. Now we live. We raise grace. We help other women who need helping. We build something that lasts longer than us. A legacy. Yes, a legacy. Not of money or property or business, but of people saved, lives changed, justice served. In October, Eleanor gave birth to their son, James Alexander Sterling, 8 pounds, healthy lungs, dark hair like his father. Xander held him with trembling hands, tears streaming down his face. Not replacement, not redemption, just new life, new hope, new beginning. Grace, toddling now at 10 months, poked the baby's face with curious fingers. Baby, Eleanor laughed, exhausted and radiant. Yes, sweetheart, your baby brother. Xander looked at his family, wife, daughter, son, and felt the hole that had defined him for 4 years finally begin to close. Not healed, not forgotten, but transformed into something that could be carried without breaking. Under the weight. Christmas 1880. Snow fell soft outside Sterling Manor, covering the world in white that actually felt clean this time. The house glowed with lamplight and warmth. Garlands hung from the mantel. A tree stood in the parlor, decorated with strings of cranberries and paper ornaments Grace had helped make. Over the fireplace, 2 portraits hung side by side. Victoria and Samuel on the left, painted from memory. Eleanor, Grace, and baby James on the right, painted from life. Not replacement, balance. After dinner, as Grace played with wooden blocks and James slept in his cradle, someone knocked on the door. Xander opened it to find a young woman on the porch. 23, maybe 24, with a split lip and bruises on her face and a baby bundled in her arms. She looked terrified, desperate, at the end of her rope. Are you Alexander Sterling? I am. I heard people in town said you helped women. Women like me. Is that true? Xander looked back at Eleanor, who had come to stand beside him. She nodded once. He opened the door wider. Come in. You're safe now. The woman stepped into the warmth, tears of relief streaming down her battered face. Eleanor took the baby, checked her over with practiced care. Mrs. Calloway appeared with blankets and hot tea, and Xander understood, finally and completely, what his fortune was for. Not accumulation, liberation, not power, protection, not legacy in the traditional sense, but legacy in the truest sense. Lives saved, families preserved, justice served one person at a time until the world changed enough that one day, maybe, women wouldn't have to run in the snow to churches that wouldn't open their doors. In the leather chair beside the dead fire, old Xander opened his eyes. Dawn had broken fully now, painting the room in shades of gold and amber. James Jr. sat motionless, tears on his face, the empty whiskey glass forgotten in his lap. Grandpa, the boy whispered. I never knew. No one did. Not really. Eleanor died in 1918, peaceful in her sleep at 61. We had 40 years together. Good years, hard years, but years that mattered. Xander stood, walked to the mantel, picked up a faded photograph. Grace Sterling, 43 years old, standing in front of Wyoming's first women's medical clinic. Beside her, James Sterling, lawyer who had just won his 100th case defending battered women in court. Your father, James, your Aunt Grace. They carried on what Eleanor and I started. Helped hundreds of women. Thousands, maybe. Changed laws. Changed minds. Changed the world just a little bit at a time. He handed the photograph to his grandson. I built an empire, boy. 3 gold mines. 50,000 acres. A fortune that even now, 15 years after I stopped working, still makes money. But none of that is what I'm proud of. What are you proud of? Xander pointed to the photograph. That. People saved, lives changed, justice served. That's what a man's legacy should be. Not what he owned, what he protected. He placed a weathered hand on James Jr.'s shoulder. You're going to university tomorrow. You're going to learn business and law and all the things young men learn to make their way in the world. And that's good. That's necessary. His grip tightened slightly. Tightened. But remember this. Wealth means nothing if you don't use it to stand between the strong and the weak, Power means nothing if you don't use it to protect those who have none. And legacy means nothing if all you leave behind is money instead of changed lives. James Jr. stood, hugged his grandfather with fierce strength. I'll remember. Good. Now get some sleep. You got a train to catch. After the boy left, Xander stood alone in the silent room. He walked to the window, looked out at Sterling Manor's grounds, at the shelter for battered women he had built in 1920 on the site of the old stable, at the tree planted where Eleanor's garden had been, now grown tall and strong, at the plaque beside the front door that read, "The Sterling Home, where the broken found shelter and the silence found voice, established 1879. He thought about Eleanor, about Grace, about Victoria and Samuel, about all the women who had walked through his door over 40 years, broken and terrified, and walked out again healed and strong. And he understood that this, finally, was what it meant to be a man. Not strength for its own sake, but strength used to protect the weak. Not wealth for its own sake, but wealth spent to serve justice. Not power for its own sake, but power wielded to give voice to the silenced. A man's true measure was not what he built. It was who he saved, and how his children carried that mission forward into a world that desperately needed more people willing to stand in the gap between cruelty and compassion. Outside, the sun rose higher, burning away the morning mist. A new day, a new beginning. The continuing legacy of one winter night when a wealthy man had chosen to stop and help instead of riding past, had chosen to spend his fortune on justice instead of comfort, had chosen to become, finally, the man he should have been all along. And somewhere, Xander liked to think, Eleanor was smiling.